All right, here we go. We are live. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another live stream. It's been a while since we did one of these. I don't think anyone's actually joined the live stream yet, but that's okay. We'll start our conversation. I'm here with the awesome Ryan Geddie, who has a political channel here on YouTube. Ryan has been doing some really great work, especially since the election in November, and he's someone I've been wanting to talk to here on the channel for a while. So I'm excited to have you here.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. And yeah, I'm sure people will be coming in pretty shortly. I just got the notification on my phone, so I'm sure people will be coming in. But yeah, thanks for having me. I've been really looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, it's cool because I feel like I don't really have the opportunity super often to talk to other creators that are my age. So I feel like we'll have a nice, interesting, different kind of discussion than
a Zoomer chat.
Yeah, I thought to myself, I was like, we got to fight it out over who gets to be the left Joe Rogan or whatever it is.
The Joe Rogan of the left. Yeah. Who isn't it? I feel like Joshua Citarella is going to be the Joe Rogan of the left. Have you seen his stuff?
I don't know who that is, actually.
Josh, I think that's his first name. I'm pretty sure that's his first name. His last name's Citarella. And I think our mutual friend JJ has been interviewed on that show. But he's got all sorts. He's like super connected, or he must be super connected because his guests are like pretty big name people. Or yeah, pretty big name people guests.
That happens sometimes where you see like a smaller channel interviewing like really major like politicians, and you're like, I wonder what the connection is there.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm kind of interested in asking you about your own political story, how you became interested in politics, your experiences with it, and I guess eventually what brought you to making your channel.
Yeah, for sure. Well, is there anything you're curious about first?
Well, I'd say, I don't know, because I feel like that's a question that I get pretty often as like a young person that talks about history and politics. Like one time I was talking to somebody who I like really respect, and he just asked me, he's like, so what's your deal? Like, why are you making videos about presidents?
Yeah.
So I feel like it's always a really interesting question to lead with.
Yeah. Well, I guess it's tough. So I've been making videos for, I think I uploaded my first video like 2 years ago or so, but I took a long break there for a while. And then I came back with I've been making political videos for, I think, a little over a year, or explicitly political videos. I would say that my videos have always had political implications, but I think my first explicitly political video was about Michael Knowles, I think. I can't remember now, but I basically just doing like the video essayist type, criticizing Daily Wire people thing. And I don't know really what drove me to start making more political videos. I think it was probably just that I had become more frustrated and the political climate had become, more and more heated up leading up to the election. And so I think I just, the closer we got, the more I was consuming political content and the more I wanted to say something.
And how did you sort of become interested in politics to begin with?
That's a hard question. I think I've sort of always been interested in politics, honestly. I mean, at least as long as I can remember. I remember being young and being interested, 12 or so, and being interested in politics. I remember, I think in 2016, that was probably like for a lot of people our age, that was like a relatively formative political moment. But honestly, I think I had developed a sort of political consciousness by then. And I definitely considered myself more liberal than most of the people around me. Because I grew up in a pretty conservative area.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really interesting because I'm one of those people that became very politically aware around 2016. I think before that, with Bush, I vaguely knew that like there was some old white guy that was president, and that's just what a president looked like. And then Obama was like Obama, and that's really the president of, I guess, both of our childhoods. But I didn't have any idea of like what Obama's policies were or anything. And then Trump was very, very formative. I think Trump declared his first run for the presidency on like my 14th birthday,
Oh
actually.
wow. Yeah.
Yeah, it was like something really funny like that. And I remember just sharing like Facebook articles of like Trump said this really, really bad thing by like Occupy Democrats and some crazy thing like that, and
Mhm.
having like old relatives and stuff like commenting like, oh, look at your communist 14-year-old. It's like, why are you yelling at me? I'm 14. But I've actually found that a lot of people our age seem like they were vaguely politically aware, but didn't become more so until 2020.
Yeah.
Like that's a lot of people that I've talked
Yeah.
to. So it's interesting to hear that you were interested in politics before that. I think. How did you react to Trump in 2016 then, given that you were already sort of politically aware?
I mean, I didn't like him. I thought, I mean, I wish that I could say I had some complicated feelings about Trump. I thought he was a buffoon. I mean, I still think he's a buffoon. And I didn't like him. I mean, just honestly, I was really hoping that anyone else would win the Republican primary um, at the time, because he was just, I think I said this in my most recent video, but he just didn't comport with what I thought a president should be. You know, he was not articulate. He was not, um, I didn't think he was very humble or like, he just didn't strike me to have any like good leadership qualities. Whenever I think of someone who's like a good leader, I don't think of Donald Trump. And I didn't think that in 2016. I think my political identity was more in flux around that time. I knew I was more liberal than my surroundings, but I think probably I wasn't exactly sure, where I identified politically in 2016. But I knew that I did not like Donald Trump.
See, I think that's fascinating because I think that a lot of the Trump discourse, especially up until the last election, was just sort of talking about Trump as this kind of anomaly,
Yeah.
right? And I think there was this kind of misguided belief among the Democratic Party and I guess the sort of anti-Trump coalition as a whole, right? That if we could just get rid of Trump, there'd be a sort of return to normalcy.
Hmm.
Like Donald Trump is the problem. If we can get rid of him, we can return to this like pre 2016 version of politics.
Hmm.
This version, like people my age and your age aren't even really familiar with necessarily.
Yeah.
It's just this thing that kind of feels like ancient history. And if that return was ever possible, I think is debatable. But the last election feels like it really solidified Trump as undeniable, which also feels so funny that that's what solidified him as undeniable kind of 9 years
Yeah.
into him being a public figure. But I think like looking back on it, he didn't win a majority of the votes in the primary in 2016,
Hmm.
loses the popular vote. There's a blue wave in the midterms, loses pretty decisively in 2020, despite like what he says. And then like in 2022, the Republicans significantly underperformed, right? So there's this sort of narrative, especially with Joe Biden, that was like the fight for the soul of America. Like
Yeah.
Trump isn't who we are. But I think you've done a lot of really interesting work about like what Trump actually means in an American context, right? Like that I
Yeah.
think has been a lot more interesting than sort of just like, oh, fight for the soul of America. Trump isn't who
Hmm.
we are. Like that's not really something we can deny anymore. There is sort of Trump is, I guess, kind of the id of the American psyche in
Yeah.
a way, right? He might not be like what you'd expect a president to be, like you
Uh-huh.
were talking about. And I'm curious on your thoughts on that because I feel like you've said a lot of interesting things.
Well, I think one of the things that's interesting about Trump is the extent to which it wasn't just, I feel like, liberals who thought that Trump was an anomaly. Like, I think to a great extent, even after 2020, I think a lot of Republicans thought that Trump was going to be sort of a flash in the pan. I think, especially after January 6th, whenever you saw a lot of like Ben Shapiro type people like temporarily jump ship. Like a lot of people forget this, but Ben Shapiro was actually one of the first people to call January 6th an insurrection. And like, I think for a brief period of time, it looked like Trump was finished. But I think after it became clear that people were not going to jump ship to DeSantis, they weren't going to jump ship to Nikki Haley. I think that's when it became really clear, not just to liberals, but also to whatever remained of the Mitt Romney Republican Party, that Trump was the Republican Party now. And remind me of your question. I sort of went off track there.
Oh, I guess the sort of your thoughts on the idea, because I feel like a lot of people that share our politics were trying to just like go back to normal. Like that was the kind of Joe Biden platform in 2020, right? Mm-hmm. And I think his fundamental failure as president was that he wasn't able to return to normal. Whether or not that was ever something that was possible in a post-COVID world, I think that his sort of political folly was that that's the promise that he made.
Yeah.
And I guess there was never any going back to that. Trump isn't this sort of aberration in the American psyche. I think you had a video in particular where you talked about Trump as a sort of continuation of Nixon and the unitary executive theory that I thought was really fascinating. Like this, I guess I thought it was interesting, the idea of Trump as a logical next step in the evolution of American conservatism, and not like this, oh, this isn't who we are, this isn't America.
Yeah, well, I think there is some respects in which Trump is a fundamentally, if not new, then at least new in the sense of how powerful it is, movement in American politics. There's always been like frankly, just a reactionary element of American politics, which I feel like more than anything else is what Trump represents. I mean, he's fundamentally like a reactionary guy. And, I think the Buchanans of the world, like, I think that would be a good example of like that sort of style of politics in America, just fundamentally reactionary. And so that isn't new. I think what's new is how successful Trump has been able to be with it. And I think that's the primary thing that's new. I think what's not new is a lot of the things that Trump is trying to do. So Project 2025, fundamentally, I appraise it as a way to expand the power of the executive to gut the administrative state, which has been a goal of the conservative movement for decades. I mean, originally, there were ideas of doing things like that under Nixon, under Reagan, under Bush, but it wasn't possible, I think. There had not been enough groundwork laid in terms of the legal infrastructure for that sort of thing. And I don't think you had a guy like Trump who was willing to just say, yeah, I'm going to ignore the courts. Like, I'm just going to do this, and I'm going to ignore what the courts have to say about it. And they might rule against me, but it doesn't really matter, because by the time they rule against me, the damage will already be done. Even if the courts rule that, USAID can't be unilaterally, the funding can't be unilaterally impounded by the executive branch, USAID is toast. Those people are going to get new jobs. The institutional knowledge is gone. That's going to take a decade. Even if there was a concerted effort to try and bring back some of these programs, it takes more than just money to make an institution effective. I mean, you need institutional knowledge, you need tenure from people, frankly, and that has been totally destroyed, I think, by the Trump administration.
Yeah, I think you get into a really important distinction there. I think that Trump is doing a lot of unprecedented things, but the type of figure that he isn't unprecedented.
Yeah.
It is the sort of argument that I was trying to make. And it's actually been really fascinating, because like me and you have been working on these two videos we're collaborating on, right? About public opinion, and mine about Andrew Jackson. And I thought it was fascinating how much sort of Trump I was getting in my research for both of those projects.
Yeah.
Like even like we were talking about the video that we're doing on your channel, and even just looking at like how the presidency has expanded in power, how often it's sort of coincided with expansions in media, and the like expansions in technology and people's ability to communicate. Like you get Theodore Roosevelt the president news by the president can spread to the entire country now. It never could before. You get FDR with the radio, JFK with the television, Trump with Twitter. For as ridiculous as it is, for as nonsensical and all these like weird AI images that he's generated, that is completely absurd and feels like very perverse in a way,
Yeah.
is a certain mastery of that platform and his ability to stay in the public consciousness. Right?
Yeah,
Like
I mean, I think Trump is definitely the social media president. You know, he's the first social media president. I think Obama was given a lot of credit back in the day for his use of social media, but that almost feels like, you know, it's like a Da Vinci glider compared to a F-16. You know, like in terms of mastery of that technology. Like Trump absolutely has wielded social media like no other politician. And it's created, I think, a new kind of politician almost. Like you see other Republicans, especially, imitating Trump's style um, on social media. Like, is it Mike Lee? He goes by like based Mike Lee.
Based Mike Lee.
Yeah. Yeah. Like that's absurd to me. Like the fact that we have a senator just appropriating like online right-wing troll culture. But of course, that's basically what Trump's done. So yeah, I think Trump has definitely utilized social media unlike any other politician before him, and I think he's changed politics in that way.
See, I'd argue that I feel like there's a difference there between Trump's version of it and someone like a Mike Lee, who I think is more akin to a sort of JD Vance in the way that he uses social media, right? Like JD Vance is online in a weird way.
Yeah.
That's very different than the weird way that Trump is online. Which I think we could say it a lot more eloquently than that. But I think you've done some really good work documenting the ideology of JD Vance as well. I think that, you know, it's weird how much pundits seem to have been dumbfounded by like his apparent evolution in terms of ideology. But I think it speaks to a profound way, a profound issue in the way that we speak about Trump in general, right? Like I think the sort of like elite establishment media or whatever was very eager to kind of embrace whatever anti-Trump Republican was out there. And I think that with JD Vance in particular, it's weird that he became a resistance darling, because if you read his book, it's all in there. It's all in Hellbilly Elegy, right? Like talking about how he's uncomfortable in these like elite spaces and how he feels like they look down on him and they look down on the kind of people he came from, and he's like being sort of glorified by these people, like advertising this book that he is insulting them in.
Yeah.
You know, it's very strange. And I think that I don't know, I guess I had a couple different questions I wanted to ask you about JD, and I feel like I just kind of melded some of them together there. But do you have any thoughts on that, I guess?
Well, JD, I think, is sort of the archetypal guy who has advanced into elite spaces but never stopped feeling insecure about himself ever. I think that's like an identifiable type of guy that JD Vance is, you know, and I think you see a lot of that in what you just said. You know, he doesn't feel comfortable hanging out, you know, with, you know, New York Times people, whether that's because they actually are looking down on him or whether it's because, you know, he has some sort of like complex that he's internalized. I don't know. I'm sure it's probably a little bit of both, to be honest. But yeah, I think he's like, you made this comment once about Andrew Jackson where you called him like, you know, he sort of didn't feel comfortable with like the old elite, but he was himself somewhat of an elite just on the frontier. And he was not, but he wasn't necessarily accepted by the old kind of WASP type establishment. And so I feel like, you know, that's a type of guy that has existed throughout history. The guy who, you know, has made it, but never stopped feeling like he's never going to be part of the big show, the big important stuff. And so you feel like you have to tear it down and build something else where you're at the top. I think that's a kind of common ideology with, you know, the Chris Rufo types of people. Are you familiar with him?
Yeah.
Yeah, where they want to sort of do their version of the march through the institutions, and they want to dismantle the universities and replace them with conservative universities, and they want to dismantle media institutions and replace them with conservative media institutions, and fire all the bureaucrats and replace them with our people, which is actually a direct quote from J.D. Vance from a few years ago. There's a certain type of guy that I feel like they think they've been shut out of elite institutions because of their political views, because of their background, because of whatever. And they want to tear it down and create a new hierarchy where they're at the top, or where they feel like they're at the top.
Yeah, I watched a bunch of your videos today, and I wrote that quote down by JD Vance. The idea of a debathification program for the U.S. is, in particular, a very like egregious thing to say.
Yeah, which is wild, right? Because that's like an ideology that for a time the United States was at war with. I mean, literally in Iraq, and so the idea that, like, I guess progressivism, some broadly defined progressivism, is equivalent to something that, you know, JD Vance sees himself as at war with progressivism or progressive ideology. That's just, yeah, I mean, I think the implications there are just wild. In addition to all his fantasizing about being, you know, some sort of, I think he called it, you know, a late Republican, as in the Roman Republic. We need like a Caesar figure, I think is the implication there, to come and, you know, save America.
Oh my God. Well, there's a lot of fascinating stuff there. And there's like 6 different questions I want to ask you based off of that response alone. But I just going back a bit earlier in your answer, you speaking about JD Vance as this kind of like fundamental outsider who, no matter what sort of layer of the elite he reaches, he's always going to feel out of place. Like there's always a sort of inherent insecurity there. I get a lot of Trump in that also. I think if you read about Trump, you know, we think of Trump as just like this Manhattan billionaire businessman or whatever, but like you read about him, and he was really self-conscious. He was from Queens, and he was like, "Oh, the Manhattan people, they don't think like they don't think I'm the real deal. They won't let me build skyscrapers. Like I'm just managing like these Queens tenements and everything." And that's, I think, where you get like the weird like gold and everything, and the like need to sell yourself in a much higher way. But I don't think Trump has the same, I guess, kind of like sophisticated philosophical perspective of like the Christopher Rufo or JD Vance that you alluded to a bit later in the answer. But I did think that was a really interesting parallel there. And also I get a lot of Richard Nixon in that description of JD Vance also. And Nixon's always someone who I've seen JD Vance in quite a bit. Even I had a similar experience reading Hillbilly Elegy that I did reading the Nixon biographies that I've read in the past. It's like, man, I'm so sorry that you're going through this, but I know this is like a villain origin story. Like you feel bad for this guy. Like you read about Nixon's siblings like making him act like a dog and like all those really crazy things and the strange things that JD Vance has been through. And then I think with Nixon, it does lead to a certain like paranoia that was very concerning to see in the presidency and leads to a lot of the crimes that you see with Watergate. And everything about Vance feels very Nixonian to me in a strange way.
Yeah, I think this is part of why he's fallen in with a sort of like tech right, for lack of a better term, like the Peter Thiels of the world. You know, JD Vance got his start through Peter Thiel. And I think a lot of those guys feel like their success does genuinely give them some sort of right to rule. Like, you know, Peter Thiel has this whole complicated philosophy along with, you know, Curtis Yarvin and those types of people where they want to, you know, establish some sort of CEO, board of directors position at the top of the United States, and then have these like little fiefdoms down below that, you know, some sort of weird techno Holy Roman Empire type situation. But they do seem to think that their success in whatever field gives them some sort of right to rule, and they feel like this makes them better than the old establishment that they're replacing, or this is how they're justifying it in their heads. I don't know if that's this is my intuition about them, I guess.
Yeah, I mean it's quite a perspective from the party that rails against big tech, right? That's
Yeah,
the real
yeah.
irony there. I don't.
Yeah,
I
well, they
guess.
rail against big tech because they perceive it as being dominated by, you know, the the ideology that they're against. You know, they don't actually care about um, the material aspects of big tech. They care about the fact that big tech is perceived to be like a progressive left institution. That's why they don't like it. And this is one of the things, actually, not to derail too much, but I think that a lot of people miss about MAGA as a movement is that a lot of it, there's definitely a material component to MAGA, but I don't think that a materialist analysis of politics is going to give you a full understanding of why some of these people are so mad. Because I think fundamentally, a lot of MAGA is driven by cultural resentment. Um, and I don't think that a material analysis is going to get you there. And so I think there were a lot of Democrats who were really, I think, way too praising of the Trump administration for like going after big tech or going after these, big institutions that they don't like because they are, socialists or they're leftists of some sort, and they don't like big tech for ideological reasons. But I don't think that's why MAGA dislikes those institutions. I think they dislike them because they perceive them as dominated by the cultural identity that they feel some sort of resentment toward. Any
Yeah,
thoughts on
I
that?
think that's interesting because it plays into the whole idea of the kind of 2024 realignment, right? It's a
Yeah.
bit played out by now, but just the image of like Mark Zuckerberg as the head of Facebook or any of these other tech CEOs, like being really compliant with like sort of like woke ideology, for lack of a better of a better term, and being kind of like annoyed in these meetings and by all these HR things and whatever,
Yeah.
and that feeling like overridden in their own capacity, and then that kind of translates to this like vaguely like right wing sort of resentment politics because they're not in charge of their companies in the way that they were before. And I think that, for as petty as it sounds, I do think is a factor that cannot be overlooked, right? It's just like these tech CEOs not liking being told what to do. But then there's also the sort of evolution of like that kind of techno libertarian faction, right?
Hmm.
Like Peter Thiel and Curtis Yarvin that you mentioned,
Hmm.
into these weird like philosopher king types. Like, I think I
Yes.
actually texted you when Bukele freaking put philosopher king in his Twitter bio, and I was
Hmm.
like, oh my god, like
Yeah.
this is really outright, like they are actually going for this. And I guess it's kind of fitting that the first millennial to be a heartbeat away from the presidency is going to be like one of these weird Silicon Valley kind of guys.
Yeah. I'll never forgive the new right for taking credit for the idea of philosopher kings. Just being able to reinvent that and then profit off of it as if it's some sort of new and unique philosophical insight. We should have the good people be in charge. Oh, really? That's crazy. Um, yeah, I think JD Vance is absolutely part of that faction. Peter Thiel has a really interesting essay because he's gone through phases where he's been more forthright or less forthright about his political ideology. But he has a really, I think, interesting in the sense that understanding of the kind of person he is from about 10 years ago, I think, called The Education of a Libertarian, where he talks about how he used to be libertarian, and over time he basically has realized that democracy is more or less uh, a failure, and that and he cites all these examples of like how it's going to be impossible to achieve a libertarian utopia ever since the expansion of the right to vote to everyone, and the expansion of I think he singles out the expansion of the right to vote to women specifically as like a thing that has been bad for libertarian ideals. So um, I think it just goes to show that they are not necessarily interested in freedom per se, at least as we typically conceive of freedom. You know, they're interested in a certain kind of freedom that I think can be most succinctly described as freedom for them, freedom for them to run their businesses however they want, freedom for them to have a certain kind of liberty untethered from cultural mores and untethered from what anyone thinks about them. Yeah. I don't know. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that, oh man, it's interesting because it, like, in these types of discussions, my mind always goes back to Kanye West. Funny enough, like I was a really big Kanye West fan back in the day. Like, Kanye probably meant more to me than any like single artist in my life, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And the sort of like fall of Kanye was just like very like way too personally of a thing for me than it should
Yeah.
have been. I've done like 2 video essays about it, and I think he's the only musical artist I've ever talked about, like ever done a full video about. And I think as a young man, and I think maybe why young men can be so susceptible to like those sort of figures, is that you look to these templates of a successful person that you admire, and like this person that's deemed a genius.
Yeah.
Right, like you can really relate to Kanye's music. You can like think Elon Musk does really cool shit. You know, like this is like like, oh my god, they're not held down to any one thing, and I'm interested in a bunch of different fields, and like provides a framework for what I can do. And then like I in very real time saw Kanye West just being really stupid. Like you would, even before like all the stupid like anti-Semitism, all the horrible things he said, you would just like watch an interview with him and you're like, this, what you're saying just doesn't make sense.
Mm-hmm.
But you're very incredible at this one thing. And that notion, I think, goes against a lot of what young men look up to in these figures, and a lot of the ways in which these figures conceive of themselves is that their success in any given field does not mean that they're going to be all-knowing and omnipotent in every single thing that they aspire to, right? Like Elon Musk has no idea what he's doing with politics. Like Peter Thiel, you know, he's not, his tech philosophy doesn't translate exactly. And I've actually been kind of mean to poor Jimmy Carter here on this YouTube channel, because I use him as an example all the time, because I say engineers do not make good presidents. Like Jimmy Carter was perhaps like the top 5 smartest presidents we've ever had. He was just not fit to be a politician, right? Like he went into politics with an engineering mindset. He's like, hey guys, look at the data on global warming. We need to not use our heaters as much, please. And like, it's data that makes sense and it's a reasonable ask, but that's not how politics works. And he'd get frustrated because he's like, guys, the data, you know. So I think this sort of idea of the infallible, kind of like the leader, the freedom for us, and we know what's best, just comes off as remarkably childish to me.
Yeah. The thing about Elon Musk is that he's so clearly lame, right? I mean, he's super rich, right? But he's like so clearly just like kind of a geek, in a way that like would not make him a successful politician. And honestly, I think the longer he hangs around the Trump administration, the worse it's going to be for them, because they just, it's 2 different types of guy. The Trump type of guy and the Elon type of guy are 2 different and incompatible fundamentally types of guys. I think Elon is kept around because he's very, very rich. And there's some interesting data out there about like how much as a percentage of Republican funding for federal elections is just Elon Musk at this point, because he's like displaced a lot of other like long-standing GOP funders. Like he is a serious percentage of like all GOP funding. Him and people that are controlled by him are basically the engines behind the money of the GOP at this point. And so I think you can't make him too mad, because I think he's also a little bit of a baby and he will flip on you and try and, you know, do his own thing if you make him too mad. But yeah, I mean, he like the jumping up and down thing, the like, I mean, it sounds silly, but I think it's little things like that make people think that this guy is just like, he's not cool at all. And, you know, I don't really think Trump strikes me as cool, but he clearly strikes a lot of people as cool. And he definitely has a sense of bravado and like, I don't know. I don't even know what you would call it. He has a certain kind of charisma that clearly appeals to a lot of people. And I don't think Elon Musk has that. He's kind of a nerd, and he's not cool in that sense.
See, I've always conceived of Trump's charisma. Well, I have this sort of line of thinking, right, of the politicians that are able to harness the popular communication of their age because of some previous experience that they had, like, made them uniquely suited for that, right? Like FDR with polio, he's like before polio, he's a really mid politician, right? Just like very average, very underwhelming. Spoke, like, used his hands way too much when he was speaking, and that was like all of his political talent came from just like really, really flailing around and being expressive. Suddenly loses all function in all of his limbs, and he has to really hone his voice. And he has to actually like lay in bed for hours reading about policy and all these things. And coincidentally, in like his like 7-year absence from politics, that's when radio comes around, and he's uniquely suited for that because of something that was completely out of his control. Or like JFK, his father was a wealthy film producer, and he was like, you know, these movies, they're really going to define the next generation of successful people. So he made sure like all 10 of his children, or 9, all 9 of his children were very comfortable on camera. Reagan, I think Reagan's the most fascinating parallel to Trump, because and I've started writing some video scripts about this that I never completed, so I might be giving myself away, but there's a sort of inherent nostalgia to Reagan because Reagan played a cowboy on TV, or played a cowboy in the movies. And during the 1980s wave of 1950s nostalgia, like you get Star Wars is a throwback to Flash Gordon and all of these things, right? Reagan in the 1980s is a literal idealized masculine image of like what a frontier American is from the 1950s. And just as the 80s were the sort of decade of the 50s throwback, so were the 2010s the decades of the 80s throwback. And Donald Trump, as a tabloid figure in the 1980s, and not only just a tabloid figure, but also a reality TV show figure later on, I think sort of mastered the trashy layer of American pop culture that is very well exemplified by Twitter. I think those two things made him so uniquely suited to harness those political movements. And I think just like with the democratization of media, right? Like you mentioned Pat Buchanan, like Pat Buchanan wouldn't exist without like Rush Limbaugh and the rise of Fox News and radio hosts and all these things. I think that Trump, as a sort of logical evolution of that, of this person who is both able to harness nostalgia in that way, like this 1980s caricature of like what a successful businessman was, like this trashy image of like what that is on TV. I don't think it's as simple as this, but I've seen people call him like a poor person's idea of a rich person. And I don't think I agree with that characterization completely, but I think there's something parallel.
There's something to it in the sense that he is not really like what a successful businessman is. You know, he isn't a successful businessman. He plays one on TV, you know, type of thing. But most people, you know, that's what it means to be a successful businessman, is to be the guy that says you're fired, and to be the guy that's large and in charge. And so I think, you know, I wonder sometimes what it would be like for someone like Mark Cuban to run for president, not because of his policy, but because he has a very like similar type of I feel like, vibe about him in the sense of being like a successful TV businessman. Yeah, I don't know. I wonder about that sometimes, just because like so many people have like he's not just a businessman. People have seen him presented as like this allegedly cutthroat, successful businessman on TV. So I don't know. I mean, I wonder. I'm sure people have made that parallel before. Whenever they're philosophizing about a Mark Cuban run for president, I don't know if he actually will do it or not. But I wonder sometimes about whether or not that's been gamed out in terms of his appeal to people.
That's a sort of hypothetical that's come up in my head before, right? Is like, what does 2016 look like in a timeline where Trump like jumped in a Democratic primary? Like what? Well, I mean, I think some of the Bernie Sanders energy, I think that Trump might have been able to kind of play on, right? A sort of like anti-establishment, whatever. Like if he wasn't, making the racial plays and he was kind of making himself more, I guess, a bit more Libby,
Yeah.
what
Yeah.
what kind of message you could have had there. Because honestly, I think there was a while there where Democrats probably would have loved to have their own version of Trump.
Yeah.
Like I think that would be a Mark Cuban's like fundamental struggle, is they would just be like, he's Donald Trump.
Yeah, yeah. I think there's probably so much antipathy towards like billionaires in the Democratic Party right now that I'm not sure that he would make it through the primary. And I don't even know if he'd be a good candidate. To be clear, I don't know anything about his policies. I just wonder a lot about him as a figure, since he's also a successful TV businessman. I think a lot of Trump's charisma though comes from the fact I'm not sure to what extent he is actually like to the extent to which he doesn't actually care about what people think about him. I think it's unclear to me sometimes how much he cares or does not care about what people think about him. But I think a lot of his charisma comes from the fact that he at least appears to just not care at all about so many things. I mean, he just doesn't care about norms around what's okay to say and what's not okay to say. He doesn't care about norms around what policies are, within the Overton window of acceptable politics. He just kind of says stuff, and then he justifies it later, or people justify it for him later. And I think that's a certain charismatic aspect of Trump, is that he just seems to be who he is, even if who he is totally manufactured.
He's authentically inauthentic. I think I've heard someone say about him before.
Yeah.
See,
I wonder if people see him at all as inauthentic, like, because he seems inauthentic to me. Like, I mean, the gold everything, I think is a great example because it's just so performative. I don't know any actual rich person that has an entirely gold house, but like, do people know that? Do people know that, like, your average rich person doesn't have an entirely gold house? Like, I don't know. Like, does Trump just seem like this type of guy? Like, does it even register for people that he is not seeming real? Or does he just, or is it just he's so unabashed about his entire personality that he seems authentic? I don't know.
See, and that makes me wonder a bit though, like, of how reluctant some Trump voters may or may not be, right? Like I knew like a middle-aged, like conservative man from the deep South who would like wear a t-shirt of like Trump pissing on like on a thing that said MSNBC or something like that, and like he'd like just that sort of like person who just
That
seems
is
like a
cultural
Trump.
resentment. That is the cultural resentment politics.
But I was gonna say that same guy would be like, I like Trump, I just wish he would close his mouth.
Yeah.
And that's really fascinating, is
Yeah.
how much of it is people looking past certain aspects, right? Because I think now Trump is just the Republican Party. They're just one and the same. They're synonymous to a certain degree.
That's probably true.
And I think that, I don't know, I guess it's weird thinking of how how much of them do really just love Trump, or how much of it is just like, okay, he's the Republican guy right now?
I think that people lie sometimes, maybe a lot, about what they actually want out of politicians. Because a good example that I often see, or that I often think of with regards to this, is people saying that they thought that Kamala was too extreme. Now, do you actually think that Kamala is appreciably more extreme than Donald Trump? Or are you just saying you think she's extreme because in your mind you correlate extreme to be bad and you prefer Donald Trump to Kamala Harris? Like, because people don't think of extreme as something, oh, I don't think your average American, whenever they're describing what they want out of a politician, says, I want extremism. I want someone to be extreme in their politics. I don't think that uh, most Americans, I don't think of themselves as extremists. And so I think sometimes, and you can get yourself into trouble doing this, and I don't know if I'm right or wrong about this particular thing, but I think sometimes reading between the lines about what people say they want and what people show you they actually want with their sort of decisions and their actions is important to do. Like the guy that you just mentioned who has that T-shirt of Trump peeing on a sign that says MSNBC, and then he says, like, I don't like it whenever Trump is so vulgar. Like, there could be a lot of things going on there. Like, maybe he feels like wearing that shirt like makes him cool, like within his like social circle, or he feels like, I'd probably have to know this guy more to say exactly what. But I think a lot of people get a sort of thrill out of Trump saying things that they just think. They probably think that MSNBC is disgusting, and I don't know about this guy in particular, but I think a lot of people, they do think that MSNBC is a terrible organization that deserves to be destroyed, and they do think that it makes them happy whenever Trump says these like naughty things. It's exciting in the same way that, like, a middle schooler discovering cursing is like exciting. Oh, like, I would never say that, but like, oh, I laugh so hard whenever he says it. So I think a lot of people just like it. I think a lot of people they just like the fact that Trump says the bad things. They like the fact that Trump says the naughty things that you're not allowed to say. That's exciting to people, especially since a lot of people agree with it, deep down, or maybe not even deep down, skin just below the surface.
See, I think you're getting at something really interesting there that makes me also think of the idea of Trump on defense, I guess,
Yeah.
right? And how it correlates with the idea of like a politician in action, a politician that actually delivers. And, I think with Trump, part of the appeal that you're talking about there is also the feeling that he's under attack, right? Like, Trump says so many ridiculous things that if you call out every ridiculous thing that he says, someone could just see like, oh my God, the news and everyone's just always criticizing Trump. They must be after him for a reason.
Yeah.
Like, he must be doing something right. Like, he's actually doing something for them to be like this up in arms and complaining this much about him. And there's sort of been debate over whether you should report like everything that Trump does. Because I think some people would be like, oh my God, like Trump like breathes and you're reporting on it and all these things and you're just over reporting the things that he does. But it's also like Trump does just do a bunch of genuinely reprehensible things that are without precedent and that like just put our country in a much worse position. And that's sort of the conundrum of covering Trump. But I think that it also gets
people
into
just like a lot of the things that he does. Oh, sorry, I totally cut you off.
Oh, no, it's okay. I was gonna say, and this gets. Well, I wanted to ask you about your Kilmar Arbrigo Garcia piece, because I thought that one was very good in particular, and I was gonna sort of connect them by saying, like, I think in the Trump first 100 days, for whatever you think about it, he felt very present.
Yeah.
Like, no one could say that he wasn't taken action, that he
Yeah.
wasn't being productive, which is also funny because he got no major legislation passed, right? Like
Yeah.
everything that he's doing can just theoretically be reversed by a Democratic president, even if like something like USAID, like we talked about earlier, could take more time. Like executive action is something that could just be undone.
Mhm.
So that's a sort of interesting, I guess, way to think about it.
I think people do want to see their politicians take action. And I think, especially after Biden, who was perceived as being basically ineffectual and weak, in large part, I think, because of his age, that um, there's something to be said about just a flurry of action. It definitely sets him apart, especially since, he's always in front of a camera, or one of his people's always in front of a camera. And they talk, in the way that they talk, and they do the things that they do in a very forceful way. And so I think people like it whenever they see their politicians doing things. And I think what you said before about people feeling like Trump is under attack, I think there's a lot of things going on there. I think you're right. Some of it does feed into the narrative that like Trump is some uniquely persecuted figure that like doesn't deserve to be persecuted this much, and he must be on to something if they're going after him this much. I think there's about 30% of the Republican Party who is genuinely like hardcore MAGA, and they do actually just like it whenever Trump. Whenever I talked earlier about people who like it whenever Trump just says like the naughty things, I think that's probably about 30% of the Republican Party, or maybe it's more now. But I think it started as like about 30% of the Republican Party, and I think those people identify with Trump as a person in a way that I don't know if there's any parallel in recent politics. Like, I think they see Trump as like an avatar of their interests uniquely. Like, and I don't know. I think that could also be part of it. There's a certain amount of people who feel like how you described, where it feeds into this narrative of Trump, he must be onto something. But I think for perhaps that other group of people that do just genuinely like it whenever people wave around the signs that say mass deportations, like I think it feeds into a different but interconnected narrative of like they are under attack. People like me are under attack. And they identify Trump as someone who is people like me.
God. Oh, I think that, man, it's interesting because I think it makes me think a lot of Trump as a sort of defining political figure, right?
Yeah.
As the most defining political figure since Reagan.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
the Trump has managed to make the Republican Party the party of Trump in a
For sure.
way that I think in the leagues of like with in terms of Roosevelt with the Democrats, Reagan with the Republicans, and that's crazy to
Yeah.
think. Like Trump, just the unlikelihood of this entire political project is kind of baffling.
Yeah.
Like could you imagine having told people that the next Ronald Reagan-esque figure in the Republican Party
Yeah.
was going to be this
Yeah.
guy?
That's something that I sort of talked about in my last video about, the things that sort of make Gen Z feel lost. Is I think a lot of people, even people that support Trump, can see that Trump is a fundamentally absurd figure. I think a lot of people, just like, even people that like him, I think if they think about it for a long enough time, would see that Trump, the reason they like Trump isn't necessarily because of his policies. They like him because of some other reason. At least people our age, they like it because he feeds into their kind of cultural feeling, and they like that he triggers the people that they don't like. I don't, but yeah, the fact that Trump is the defining figure of this era of politics. I mean, the fact that we're talking about him, the fact that during the Biden presidency we were still talking about him. That was, I think really whenever it became clear that Trump was going to be the defining figure of this era of politics was during the Biden presidency, the fact that Trump was still the dominant figure in US politics. People never stopped talking about him, even whenever he was no longer in charge. I think that really solidified his claim to be a sort of era defining president. I mean, for a whole decade now, he's been there.
I think going back to the sort of Andrew Jackson video that we were alluding to earlier, I think the last piece of writing that I did on that was about the three elections that Jackson ran in, right? Like he runs for the first time in 24 against John Quincy Adams, who is literally the most establishment Washington figure you could probably have at the era. But it's actually like a five-way race, I believe. It was either 4 or 5. And Andrew Jackson gets the most votes, but they end up, it goes to the House of Representatives, and they give it to John Quincy Adams.
Yeah.
And for the entire 4 years of the Adams administration, Jackson is basically what Trump was, which is a shadow president.
Yeah.
Right? Like him and his proxies are all over the country, just attacking everything that the current administration does, presenting themselves as the alternative. And I think that especially in today's kind of anti-incumbent climate, that power to be the clear leader of a party so early on, and to be able to just present yourself as the alternative to the current administration is a sort of political fortune that I think we underestimated going into this election. And I think the thing that made me, like, I thought Kamala Harris was going to win, and I was wrong, clearly. But I think the biggest concern going into the election for me was that the last time that we changed presidents without changing parties was H.W. Bush in 88. Right? To a certain degree, the United States is just an anti-incumbency sort of country. Not when it is the same president running for re-election, like presidents often get reelected, but to change figures without changing the politician or without changing the party is just kind of out of our question. And I do think that Trump benefits from that also, because 2024 felt like a vindication of Trump. Like he was reelected. It was probably the greatest political comeback in the history of this country. I think that he will sort of go down in the history books as to some degree a winner, right? But I think it's likely that he'll also have like completely sink to the bottom of the polls by the end of his administration, like Bush did. But there's still that reelection.
That's interesting. I hear that a lot. He staged a great political comeback. And is that true? Like, was he ever like that far behind in the polls? I mean, he lost 2020. That's true. But his control of the Republican Party, except for maybe like a week after January 6th, there was, and that was a real period of time. There was a real period of time, I should say, between January 6th and whenever he was acquitted in the Senate, that it looked like Trump may actually be finished this time. Like it looked like they may actually impeach him for a brief period of time. And if that happened, I think Trump is finished. Like I think that would have finished Trump. But I think after that, he didn't even need to go to the debates for the Republican primary the next time around. And DeSantis, I see someone say in the comments, DeSantis had a brief moment. I think that's true, but did he ever pass Trump in the polls for the primary? Maybe for a brief time. I think that may be true. And there was a time whenever a lot of conservative commentators were trying to push DeSantis as like the sensible alternative to Trump, who was just so crazy that he couldn't be effective. And I think, it is a great political comeback in the sense that he lost and then won. But I think in the sense of whether or not he was going to win the 2024 election, You know, I think definitely he was always at least competitive, if not leading Biden. And then when Kamala came in, it looked like Kamala might, you know, especially whenever she first jumped in, you know, she got a lot of attention, and then I think by the end it had evened out again. So I think you're right. He will be known as someone who had a great political comeback. I just wonder about where this narrative necessarily comes from.
See, okay, I think that I understand what you're saying, but I think if this was anybody but Trump, I think it would seem a lot more impressive.
I mean, it is impressive.
Than
I
it
think it
does.
is impressive.
I think the idea of a president in the modern day losing
Yeah.
and just having the balls to run for re-election again, going through all of the criminal charges, like post January 6th.
Yeah.
I think especially in like that week after January 6th that you're mentioning, the idea that this man would come back and win the presidency, I think that's another important detail, is not only did he win back the presidency, he won it by more than he did before.
Yes.
Right? Like
yes.
he won the popular vote. This was the, you know, it
the
wasn't like a
assassination
crazy
also
mandate
contributes
or
to
anything.
the narrative, like the fact that he got shot. I think that contributes to this narrative. So I think you're right. I mean, he definitely will be remembered as having a great political comeback. I just don't think he was ever like, in truth, that far behind, except for a couple brief periods of time. But you're right. It is unprecedented in the modern era for that to happen, for a president to lose and then come back and win, you know, and win by more than before. So you're right. I think by that standard, he definitely will be remembered as having had a great political comeback.
See, another thing I wanted to ask you about. We have not talked much about Gen Z, and that's something that I really wanted to get your opinion on, because we're talking about Trump and we're talking about all this craziness. We talked about it a bit at the beginning as well, but just the idea that for most people our age, you know, for me and you, this has been our normal. This has been our only conception of politics. And you alluded to it a bit earlier, right? Like Gen Z's relationship with Trump. And I'm curious what you make of this sort of I guess political movement among young men in particular that news outlets have been so keen to talk about.
I think this can also be a little bit overstated. I mean, there's definitely is like a political movement among young men to the right. And I think that is driven primarily by social media. I think it can be overstated the degree to which it is ideological. I don't think there's like some sort of I think it's cultural. I think that's my analysis of why young men feel attached to Trump. It's not like, I think there can be too much made of the fact that like young men have some sort of like attachment to like Trump's tariffs or something. Like, I don't think people care about that. Like no one cares about Trump because of his positions on tariffs. People care about Trump because he's Trump, because of his personality, because of he's perceived to be going after cultural enemies. And I think that's especially prominent for young men who probably don't have that much experience with politics. They don't have that much of a political education. And so a lot of the way that they're perceiving politics is through that more, that less policy-driven lens. They also have less on the line in terms of their like, you know, young people don't care a whole lot about like Social Security. Whenever Trump talks about like gutting Social Security, like that doesn't mean much to someone who's 20. I don't know. I'm sort of rambling here, but do you see sort of what I'm saying?
Yeah, I definitely understand what you're saying. I think that it's funny because tariffs seems like where a lot of, at least people I know in my personal life, like young men that gravitated towards Trump, were like, wait, what?
Yeah.
He's doing this thing that he said he was going to do. You know, like, which is very funny. And I think the point that you're making about young men can sort of be made about the electorate in general.
I think that's probably true. Yeah.
Like to what degree culture kind of kind of affects it. Well, like a while ago, I was working on a history of conservatism video. It was like an hour long, and it was this big mess because I talked about a bunch of different things, and I was having trouble making it coherent, and it's kind of in limbo now. but but I think something in it, the what I guess was a bit black pilling, for lack of a better term, and it sucks to say because I kind of hate being pessimistic. And I
Yeah.
think that's a big problem among sort of our generation all the time. But the sort of notion of like looking at conservatism all the way back to like post Civil War era, then like towards like the Roosevelts and eventually like civil rights, it's just always been woke. It's just always been cultural questions sort of affecting political opinions, right? Whether it's coming off of the Civil War, or like FDR having to be in coalition with Southern segregationists and excluding like Black Americans from the New Deal, and then you get like Nixon and JFK are actually fighting over Black voters as swing voters for the first time, which is
Yeah.
like really incredible. And then after that, obviously, you get LBJ and Nixon with the Southern strategy, like that through line of cultural issues of, like it's always been there. It's just different shapes of woke to some degree is kind of
Woke. Yeah. I mean, woke.
disconcerting.
What is different between woke and like being a social justice warrior? Like 10 years ago, whenever people still said social justice warrior, like it's the same thing. I think, we call things woke that we would have called like being an SJW like 10 years ago. Like it's just the same type of thing. And then before that, maybe we would have said like bleeding heart or something, this bleeding
Or just
heart.
liberal was
Yeah,
a bad
just
word for a
liberal. Yeah,
while.
that's probably true. Yeah. But like, the word changes, but the idea stays the same. And I think, woke is just the next iteration. We'll probably get another word, after the Trump era, because one day this guy will no longer be around, and, we'll have some sort of, I don't know. I'm imagining, Trump. I don't know. I imagine sometimes what the Republican Party will look like after Trump, but I don't know. That's, I wanted to sort of make this point about why I feel like Republicans attract more young men. And this is going to sound a little ridiculous, I think, straight off, but stay with me for a second. Are you familiar with like Dean Withers, like those types of guys?
Yeah, I see his posts on social media from time to time.
Yeah. So like he's like a, debater type guy. I don't think any 20 something guy wants to be him. I don't I just watch his content and I think like this is not someone that like a 20 something year old guy can like look up to necessarily. I don't think. I think part of it is that he's so young. And so maybe he'll be more of like a leading figure for like a younger generation of people. But I think for our generation, he's so young and he's also like so, I don't know. I think he just culturally does not appeal to the same type of person who is into like Andrew Tate necessarily. Like I don't know. Like I think what we're really missing on the Democratic side isn't like people like that. I think it's, we talk about like a left Joe Rogan, but I think there's less talk about the left's ability to have produced someone like Joe Rogan. I'm not sure that the left could produce a Joe Rogan, because Joe Rogan is sort of defined by his like almost, it's very normal guy. It's very normy, but it's also like very sort of conspiratorial and like open-minded. And I don't know. I just don't know that type of guy can exist on the left. It's too intellectual. Like it's perceived as being too intellectual, too like not into code things, too I don't know, too ideological, I guess.
I think I would push back on that a little
Yeah.
bit by saying that Joe Rogan was on the left broadly until fairly recently, right? Like I know he's always been a bit more right wing coded on trans issues in particular, but like he was a Bernie voter in 2020, right? Like he talked about UBI. He said, I think there's a clip of him saying like I've never voted Republican in my life. Like
Yeah.
Rogan is someone who it really seems like was part of this large COVID realignment, you know. So
Yeah,
I would
I think
say
he was. I think he was. Yeah.
I think the identity of the Democratic Party probably has shifted a bit away from that sort of like image of masculinity that we're talking about there. I think it didn't used to be as stark of a divide as there is right now. I'm curious what you think of that.
I think Joe Rogan was a Republican, I mean, a Democrat in the same way, or not the same way, but a similar way to Donald Trump used to be a Democrat, because they both sort of hung out. I mean, Joe Rogan, for all of his, normal guy bona fides, is he's a media guy. I mean, he's been involved in media for like his whole career. He hung
Yeah.
out with people who are undoubtedly more left wing than he is. He hung out with in predominantly left wing spaces, and the same can be said, I think, of Donald Trump whenever he's sort of identified as a Democrat. I don't think that Joe Rogan has much of an ideology. I mean, this is sort of the criticism that you hear about him a lot, is that he just kind of becomes a sponge for whoever he's talking to. And I think that he's been around a lot of people for, as I think, especially ever since he moved to Austin, who are, more doctrinaire conservatives. And I think he's become more conservative as a result. And I think there's I don't know. I'm not sure I have fully developed thoughts on this. I'm sort of working through it as I talk. But I think Joe Rogan is an archetypal example of a certain type of guy who has become more right wing. And I think it speaks to what right wing means in 2025. I think to be right wing in 2025 is, to a certain extent, it encompasses guys like Joe Rogan, who I don't know, however you would define his personality. And I think he may have been late to that game in terms of his actual voting patterns, but I think guys like Joe Rogan have been moving to the right for a long time.
There's a comment here by Script, who's actually a mod over on the Discord server, who does really great work there, by the way. Thank you for all that you do. He said, see, the issue with democratic masculinity is like Tim Walz, flabby, outdated, who get ruined by upstarts like Vance. I think for the Dems to tap into men, they'll need appealing men, etc. Example, Obama. I think that's really fascinating because, if you read about the election, Tim Walz really like pitched himself out of the gate as soon as Harris was in talks to be the nominee, as their answer to masculinity, right? And it's funny because like on paper he does seem like he would work, but to what degree is the aesthetic the sort of like buff kind of guy, right? Like RFK Jr. doing weird push-ups shirtless and in jeans. Like what does that sort of image what is the importance of it? Because Trump isn't someone who's like a particularly like picture of masculinity or anything in terms of
Yeah.
physical appearance, but
I think there's a certain extent, and I don't think people talk about this very much because I think it's a little doomerish, but I think there's an extent to which being right wing has been coded as masculine. And so you get, and being left wing has been coded as feminine. And so it doesn't even necessarily need to be that Donald Trump is more typically masculine. I think, people can point to masculine qualities about Trump, but he's always going to be perceived as having a baseline level of masculinity by being right wing. And I think that's also one of the reasons why you're seeing more of a gender divide, is that guys feel like to be a man, they need to be right wing. They need to be on the right. And it would be like feminine to not be. And I don't know how to fix that. And I don't know, except through, because it wasn't always this way. In history, it hasn't always been that way. But I think that's a cultural change that is not necessarily something that can be changed within one election cycle. I don't think. I think Democrats often fall into the trap that they can flip the narrative within an election cycle, like with someone with Tim Walz, for example. You can't just parachute this guy in and have him, go hunting and, talk about being a football coach. And, Tim Walz was fine. I didn't have a problem with Tim Walz. I wish that I wish that they let him do more of what I feel like he was good at, because I got the impression that they sort of muzzled him a little bit. So I wish that they had let him be more of what I perceived to be his like authentic self whenever he was being kind of a little bit mean to the Republicans. I think people liked that. But I think that the campaign, for whatever reason, did not like that.
Are you saying the woke, feminine Democratic Party stopped Tim Walz from being his masculine himself?
No, not even necessarily that, because I think it's a lot of men who are in charge of the Democratic Party. I mean, it's not just women who are in charge of the Democratic Party. It's a lot of guys too. I mean, but culturally, I think being right wing has been coded as masculine. And I think that's one of the reasons why a lot of young men have swung as well, because it's perceived as the culturally correct thing to do for their gender, I guess. And I'm not some sort of gender theorist. I don't have very deep thoughts about this, but I definitely do think that right wing has been coded as masculine, and left wing has been coded as feminine. I don't know. I don't think that's a new phenomenon, but I think it's become a more heightened phenomenon.
Yeah, I think there's also a sort of I think there's a bit deeper of a correlation between masculinity and conservative thought, where I do think, in particular, like I know we've been talking a lot about the tech right, this sort of idea of like the self-sufficient man. Of like, I am going to get my money and I'm going to invest it and I'm going to make something of myself with these things, and I don't need all of these dependencies. I'm going to pull myself up by my bootstraps. I think there is a sort of degree there to which I think people like to think of. I remember there was a guy I worked for once who's a really, really nice guy. And I was talking to him about politics. He was a very conservative guy. And we were talking about like tax policy. And I was like, oh, like I think richer people, like millionaires, should pay more taxes. And he's like, yeah, but like you could be a millionaire one day. Like that could be you. And I think there is a sort of dichotomy there of like, this, oh, I could be that. Like I could be the successful person. How will I, like maneuvering the world with that possibility in mind? And I think there is a certain degree to which I think left-wing thought can sort of struggle, right? Because as you're diagnosing all the kind of problems with society, I guess you can sort of become consumed by that, right? Like you have to believe you can achieve something to like go out and achieve it. And if you feel like there are, there are very real social factors that hold people back, economic factors that hold people back, but there is a certain degree there to where like you have to believe you can succeed.
I think that's true.
There's a balancing act there. And I do think there's something kind of unappealing to some young men in the Democratic Party of like, oh, I need help. Right? I do think, and I'm not a gender theorist either. That's just some sort of I guess miscellaneous ideas.
One thing that I think about a lot is I remember reading an article about Italian political history, and it talked briefly about how in a particular period of time in the I can't remember if it was the 19th or 20th century, but men were often more left-wing than women because men's social lives was organized primarily through their work, which was for a lot of men unionized. And so they had like a lot of exposure to like union stuff. And women at that time were more conservative because their social lives were organized primarily through church. And so I think about this sometimes whenever I think about the social institutions that men exist in and whether or not those are right wing or left wing. And I'm not sure there is like a male coded left wing institution, like at all. Like sports is definitely coded as more right wing. Gaming, I feel like for some reason is coded as right wing. I think you used to be able to say universities were coded as left wing, but even these days, men are not the majority of people in universities. And so I don't know. I wonder about that sometimes, the social institutions that people interact with and how that impacts their politics. I don't know. Can you think of any like social institution that's like male coded but also left coded?
I mean, I was going to add on to the university point that both you and I are college graduates.
Yep.
You know, like that. I would be curious. I'm sure there's a million studies on this, but what the diploma divide specifically looks like among men in terms of the politics. Because I do think the university is the primary left-wing institution that men will be exposed to in their lives. But I think that perhaps in more urban areas, there could be more like social clubs. There could be, you know, more opportunities for interaction there. But I do think it speaks to the decline of institutions in general. And then that's also something I really wanted to talk to you about. You know, like are the kids okay, Ryan? Are we?
I think the kids are simultaneously okay and not okay, which is a deeply unsatisfying answer. I think the kids have never been more materially well off. The kids have never been more materially well off. But I think there is a feeling that Gen Z is worse off in a lot of the ways that actually matter. So one of the things that I talked about in the last video is like housing and education. You know, these are two really big things, and these two things have gotten dramatically more expensive, while things like technology and toys basically have gotten much cheaper. You know, TVs used to be a lot more expensive than they are now, and phones. You know, iPhones are expensive, but the iPhone was $1,000 for a long time. And in real terms, you know, that's a decline in terms of its actual cost, just because of how much inflation we've had. We've never had more access to entertainment, to consumable goods. But the things that you need to really get ahead in life in ways that we perceive to be getting ahead in life as, you know, mattering, housing and education, those things have gotten more and more expensive. They've gotten more and more out of reach. So that's I think the metrics by which Gen Z is better and worse off.
I think that while the material conditions for the most part are better, there is a certain sense of despair that I think just permeates the conversation.
Yeah.
You know, like the sort of general feeling of we are not going to be better off than our parents were.
Yeah.
And I think that is a very powerful thing.
Yeah,
Like it.
I think people know that, like, the fact that you can have Instagram now is not going to make you better off. You know, like in the long term, that, you know, it might make you happy, but I think people know that, like, there's a difference between being happy and being secure. And I think the security is what a lot of Gen Z people are lacking, a sense of uh, security and belonging. I don't I don't think we're lacking for material comforts.
And
Yeah.
but I also like going back to the sort of subject of community. I do think that the rise of the internet and all of these online spaces can be simultaneously like infinitely connecting and isolating,
Yeah.
right? Like me and you could never have this conversation. Like we likely would have never met each other
Yeah.
if
Yeah.
it hadn't been for this. But also, to what degree are people, like not going to like coffee shops or libraries and all these things where they would usually go to? I know there's a lot of third place discourse among like people our age, and I
Yeah.
think that there is something genuinely um just really impactful about being the first generation that always has the answer to any question ever in the palm of
Yeah.
your hand. Like that is liberating and terrifying in a way that I don't think we're going to understand for a very long time. And I think that, that sort of, and I think it speaks to something inherent in social media, right? Like you can see the like horrors of like genocide in Gaza on
Yeah.
your Twitter feed and then
Yeah.
scroll and then you see like the stupid Trump like AI as friggin' the Pope or something.
Yeah.
Like there's this kind of just constant stimulation, constant input that does just, I think, make it harder to kind of exist on a day-to-day basis for a lot of people. And that sort of, like Trump doesn't exist without that, I think. And I often wonder about what a politician our age is going to look like
Yeah.
who had their formative experiences in this moment. Like I think JD Vance, just by virtue of how young he is, but also by virtue of I guess how online he is, like he was in those group chats with like those teenagers and stuff. Like he
Yeah.
is I think JD Vance presents as a lot younger than he is. And I feel like, I don't know, I can kind of get scared sometimes that there's a bit of the first Gen Z vice president in JD Vance and some cultural factors, and that's not always a good thing.
Yeah. I wonder what the first Gen Z, because there's a few Gen Z like lefties, you know, like
Mhm.
David Hogg, you know, I think he's Gen Z, right? He must be.
Yeah, JD David Hogg's the same grade as me, and I went to school like pretty close to Parkland too,
Oh,
so we
okay. Yeah.
mhm.
Yeah. And then Maxwell Frost, he's also from Florida, isn't he?
Yeah, Orlando. I was at a
What is it
Brazilian
about Florida?
soccer game. I'm sorry.
Oh, no. You were at the same soccer game?
Oh no, I was at a Brazilian soccer game, like two Brazilian teams from the state that I'm from, Brazil, playing in
Hmm.
Orlando, and Maxwell Frost came out like before the game,
Oh,
and he
that's
was
great.
like, he was like, "Hey guys," and no one there knew who he
No one
was
knew who he
except
was.
for me. And I was
Yeah.
like talking to my girlfriend. I was like, "Lily, that's Matt. That's the Gen Z congressman."
Yeah.
Like no one cares.
That is so funny. Yeah. That's funny. So he was there that he was there just to like
Yeah,
open
I mean
the game or
he
something?
represents Orlando. I guess he was
Okay.
in
Oh,
was in
yeah.
town that day. I'll see
Gotcha.
if I can find the photo.
That's interesting. Yeah, it's funny whenever politicians do stuff like that. I wonder sometimes how many politicians are in the game just to do things like that as well. Like some of them I feel like really enjoy being in the parade, and stuff like that.
I'm
Um,
seeing if I can pull up the photo.
but yeah, what is it about Florida producing all these like young left wing people? Did Maxwell
Man,
Frost have a connection to the Parkland shooting?
Not that I know of at all, but Parkland was huge because
Yeah.
I'm from Broward County, so it's the same county as Parkland,
Yeah.
and like that was my junior year of high school. I remember like I went
Mhm.
to grab food with my friends, and like it was we were at Wingstop actually of all places,
Yeah.
and you look up on the TV and it's just like school shooting, like right by where we were.
Yeah.
It was really strange. Like a
Horrible.
friend of mine like lived over there and his bus got stuck like in front of Parkland for hours, just like and that like really fundamentally sort of changed what school was like.
Mhm.
Like, being so close to it. Like the school was empty for the rest of the week. I don't know what it was like all over the country, but when we came back from break that year, every school in the county was completely like just gates all over the place,
Yeah.
fences where there weren't fences, like
Yeah.
the doors all locked, super super strict. And I think that was really like defining
Yeah.
for people that grew up around here. As far as being more see, I think on gun violence in particular, like there were marches all
Yeah.
over. Like every
Yeah.
high school in Broward County was doing
Yeah.
marches. And man, like I don't know. I think with guns in particular, well, it's funny actually. I know a guy who's a Douglas survivor who became a really big Second Amendment guy because of it, which
Mhm.
is like the opposite of what most people took away from
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
Who am I to speak to his experience as a
Yeah.
survivor? I guess. I don't know. Well, Florida's strange because it's supposed to have been a swing state, right? Until 2020, but we
Yeah.
haven't had a Democratic governor in my lifetime. The last
Yeah.
Democratic governor was in the 1990s. Closest we have is Charlie Crist, who was governor when I was a child. Was a Republican, became an independent afterwards, and then ran against DeSantis in
Yes.
22 as a Democrat,
Mhm.
which is like the just such a terrible candidate. And it's strange too, because like in 2018, I knew someone that worked for the Gillum campaign, and he was like really, really big into it. He was like, "We're gonna do it. We're gonna win." And Gillum loses by less than a point, I think. And I remember that entire election. Like I was interested in politics, but Florida politics never really caught my attention. I didn't even really know DeSantis' name. It was just like
Yeah.
the white guy that Gillum was running against.
Yeah.
And COVID really catapults DeSantis. Really, really catapults DeSantis in a way that I hadn't seen like a local Florida government official be. But I never paid that much attention to him, but I did think it was kind of absurd for DeSantis in particular because like he was my governor for years and I didn't really know anything about him, right? So the idea of him was like the future, like that weird post they made about him was always kind of preposterous. But the Florida Democratic Party, I feel like it's just kind of in shambles a lot
Yeah.
of the time. Like David Hogg, for as impressive as what he's done becoming DNC vice chair has been, I don't think he's particularly associated with Florida.
Yeah.
Right? Like I don't see him running for office here. We have like Jared Muskowitz is a congressman who I kind of despise, who's also local to the area, and I kind of hate seeing his face all over the place. But I don't know. I guess I other than Maxwell Frost and even Maxwell Frost isn't necessarily like super super progressive. I know like he flipped his position on Israel and Palestine during his campaign.
So
Also,
from what to what?
he was a pro Palestine as an activist,
Okay.
and I believe had some APAC money, you know.
APAC money donated against him or APAC money donated to him?
I don't remember necessarily if
Maybe a threat of one and then the other.
either there was a threat of APAC money and he folded,
Yeah.
or there was actual APAC money and he changed his position.
Yeah.
Sorry, that I went on a whole Florida tangent just
No,
there.
no, no. It's interesting because, of course, I mean, you know this, but the people watching may not know. I'm from Texas, and I've lived in Texas my whole life, and I can sympathize a lot with the Democratic Party at the state level, feeling like it just is in shambles. Because I mean, I don't know even when the last Democratic I think it was Kay Granger was the last
Oh.
statewide Dem in Texas politics, and yeah, I mean the Democrats haven't won a statewide election in Texas in so long that I don't even think that they know what it would be like to win. I don't even know what they would do. You know,
All
it's kind of like a dog catching the car moment, because it's the Democrats in Texas have operated for so long as like a basically ineffectual opposition party that they don't even I don't even know what they would do. What would their agenda be if they won? I have no idea. All I
see,
know is what they oppose from, decades literally of Republican total domination.
I'm curious because I know that some states still have some of like the I guess the kind of holdovers, right? Like the Joe Manchin
Yeah.
types, Andy Bashir to a lesser extent, where like they have personal affinity for the Democratic Party, right? Like I think Hillbilly Elegy. I read Hillbilly Elegy recently, so that's it's been
Yeah.
really top of mind for me. But like he talks about his grandma, how she never wanted to let go of her Democratic Party of the working man, even though she's like very, very aligned with modern day Republicans. Would you say the Democratic Party in Texas seems more like on par with the National Democratic Party, or is there some sort of holdover of like the old Democratic constituency there in the past?
I don't think that there's really any holdover from the old Democratic constituency. Not anymore. Maybe 10 years ago. Um, the best example that I can think of this that really I think illustrates this point is there's been a big fight in Texas recently about school vouchers. And so, are you familiar with that concept, like
Mm.
for private school? So they wanted to give, or I think they will. I'm not sure if Abbott's actually signed the legislation already, but he will if he hasn't if he has not done so yet. But they're going to give $10,000 to every kid who is attending a private school, basically, to pay for tuition, which is good for the people that attend those private schools. But because of the way that the bill is organized, it's quite bad for people that live in rural areas, which is
Mhm.
obviously a very Republican area.
Mhm.
Um, I think the fact that the Republicans have continued to be so dominant in those areas, there used to be like an anti-school voucher Republican Party of Texas, I should say, an anti-school voucher Republican Party of Texas coalition, and there still is to an extent. But Greg Abbott did a whole campaign of primarying those people, basically, and replacing them with more his people that would vote for the school voucher thing. And I think the fact that he was basically successful at that, and that those people all won very handily in their general elections, or mostly all won very handily in their general elections, shows that no, I don't think that the old, like, people who would have benefited from like rural electrification and stuff, like those people are either no longer alive or they are Republicans now. I don't think that those people are
Yeah,
around anymore.
rural electrification is like in Texas is such an incredible story, right?
Yeah.
Like I've got the years of Lyndon Johnson behind
Hmm.
me, and just like what a just like clear representation of what government can actually do in people's lives, and then
Yeah.
the sort of stuff that did make the Democratic Party the institution that it was in the American South. I think it's really fascinating because it just sort of dawned on me that you and I come from the two sort of like Republican dream states, I
Yeah.
guess.
Yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
like the places that people have been sort of migrating to, and it's interesting because I'm not sure if you've seen this phenomenon online, but I've kind of come across this type of person who's like, the dream is red state, blue city.
Yeah.
Like that is the
Yeah.
sort of ideal place to live. Like lower taxes, we still get the sort of benefits that come with living in an urban area. And if you look, I don't know about Texas, like Florida in particular, like Tampa is the fastest growing city in the state. like
Yeah.
Broward County, Miami-Dade, West Palm, like are exploding, and like the less populated parts of Florida are growing too, to a lesser extent. But even the people that are coming here are moving into the urban areas, and it's interesting because there is just like, to a certain degree, politics is a urban rural divide, unless you're Miami-Dade and everything's like overrun by Cubans talking about socialistas. I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that.
The red state, blue city thing is funny to me because I think it reminds me of a phenomenon that I've noticed where a lot of these like new right elite types, like the Peter Thiels of the world, I could never imagine them hanging out with people from like my hometown ever in a million years. They would not get along with them. I mean, Peter Thiel is gay, if I remember right, and like people can be pretty homophobic still, like I could not imagine Peter Thiel getting along with the average MAGA, replacement level MAGA supporter. So the extent to which this is a coalition of two very different types of people is interesting to me. And I think that that's exemplified by the red state, blue city thing, because Peter Thiel would never live in a rural area. He obviously, I mean, I think he talked one time about like how, he's never going to leave, like San Francisco or something, because he likes it. I mean, fundamentally, these people are comfortable they're comfortable with the fruits of liberalism, I think, and they want the social environment that liberalism can provide, but they want to harness the conservatism of people that they never interact with. I don't know. Curtis Yarvin is another good example of this. I watched his interview that he did with someone at the New York Times, and he talked about, how he sends his kids to like, some sort of frou-frou liberal private school, like some Montessori thing or something, and it's like, some of these people never engage with the constituency that they're harnessing in order to actually gain power. And so the red state, blue city thing just reminds me of that dynamic a little bit.
I'm glad that you say that, because I've been to Texas very little. Like one of my striking, I did a cross country drive from Phoenix all the way over back home, and I drove overnight from Albuquerque to Dallas.
Yeah,
and I'm just driving through rural Texas, and there's just like a sea of blinking red lights, and I'm like, what is this? I had no idea. It was kind of eerie.
Yeah.
And you get closer, and I realized they were just giant windmills, just all over the place, just like massive windmills, and that's not a thing here.
Yeah.
And then like we kept driving, and all of a sudden, like it starts storming, but there's no rain, and there's like electricity all over the place, just in this, like lighting up the sky, making it look like daytime, like a dry storm. And I had never seen anything like that either. And I'm like Googling this phenomenon. I'm like, how does this happen? And I was just thinking about like how terrifying it must be to just live like out in the middle of nowhere, especially before like rural electrification.
Yeah.
Like the sheer amount of loneliness there that like a LBJ would have experienced growing up or something like that. Even like we stopped to switch drivers at some point at like an old gas station where like the pump was still metal and all these things. And it was just extremely scary. I don't know. And there's a certain degree, I guess, to which rural America, that idea of being out in the middle of nowhere, that the government coming to help you felt so out of reach in a way that speaks to the way that the government feels now. Government doesn't feel like it's all around you and helping you in that way. And whatever my rambling story about driving through Texas, I think it does speak to a sort of transformation that occurred within the Democratic Party during the New Deal. And like someone said here in the comment section, like, do you guys believe transit is the next rural electrification that Dems can push? And I don't know. I don't know, because I'm thinking about it in a way that, like, of how Democrats could ever possibly appeal to rural voters again. You know, that we're such an important part of that coalition at a time where like people could win majorities and not just swing, you know, constantly from elections. That was a really incomplete thought. I feel like I really rambled on that one.
No, I'm not sure what Democrats could do to win rural voter, just because I think to some extent rural and conservative and Republican have all become such a congealed cultural identity that it's hard to imagine a Democrat coming into like a rural area and being able to win. I don't know. I'm not sure, because transit. I mean, I like, you know, I appreciate transit, and I think that would be good. But that, you know, I don't think that would benefit rural areas as much as it would benefit like urban areas, because to be economical, I feel like it would have to connect like big cities, right, to get enough people to ride between them. And I'm imagining like, I mean, maybe, I mean, you could, I guess there used to be like transit, like the kind of streetcar suburb situation where people, you know, there were smaller, less frequent transit options into big cities. So maybe I could see that, but the suburbs and exurbs are so far out now, and especially rural areas. I'm not sure about. I mean, I think transit would be great. I just don't know if that would be the way to capture the hearts of rural voters. I'm not really sure where I'm going with that. I think rural, at least the area that I'm familiar with, which is probably more accurately described as like exurban than rural, because it was a town of like, I think it was pushing 10,000, I think, by the time I graduated high school. Like, so not a city really, especially because there was no like city center really. It was just kind of like the highway and then stuff around the highway. And I don't know what those people would want. I don't know. I can't imagine some of those people ever in their entire lives voting for a Democrat, just because it's become so much of a cultural identity for them to vote Republican.
Yeah, I think I'd have to do more research on it, but there is the sort of idea of all these railroad towns that really popped up, right? Just because they were on the way, the sort of the path they used to connect this country all over the place. You know, I think it seems like it would have been a lot more viable of a thing to do as we developed, rather than trying to go and do it all today. Unfortunately, you know, like the cross country railroad used to be a lot more of a thing in this country, and I'm not sure exactly why it went away so much. Like I said, I have to do more research on that. But I think that it does speak to a kind of you know, like the fall of the American downtown. Like the event in Kansas with Mr. Beat, I drove to that, and there was this sort of like American heartland downtown that I had never really experienced, that I got to see for the first time, which was really incredible. And I think it's funny because being in Florida, you know, our boom, and I find a way to bring this up every live stream, but our boom really comes after World War II. You know, so we exist primarily in like the car dependent phase of American history. There's not that remnant there, or at least South Florida, where I'm from. You know, like this all used to be Everglades until it got drained. Our downtowns look extremely different. Like our downtowns are completely dependent on the beach. Like there's not that sort of, I guess, sense of community and like practicality that you see, you know. And like there was this oh my God, there was this beautiful little town in the middle of Kentucky called Paducah that
Mhm.
had like a mural just all along the I think it's either the Ohio or the Tennessee River, just of like the evolution of the town from from like the frontier days up to the modern day. And it was this beautiful thing all along there. And there was just a sense of like history there. And I do think there is a bit of the American downtown that has kind of gone away, like you spoke about, the being a town that doesn't have that one center unifying place.
Yeah. Yeah. I think in Texas, it it depends on where in the state, because I think you can look at pictures of Fort Worth, which is where I live, before and after the highway, and you see, they tore down a bunch of the city to build the
Mm.
highway, right? And I think that was because Fort Worth grew around the railroad. It really boomed with the railroad because people would drive the cows up to the railroad, and then they would put them on the railroad, right, and go somewhere else. And so Fort Worth really grew around the railroad, but um, they tore it down, and I don't know, our modern pattern of urban development, where we put the jobs in the city and the houses not in the city but near the city, is just one that I think, I talk about this sometimes, but it's a fundamentally unsustainable pattern of development, because the value of the house, or at least in the sense of like using it as a tool to build wealth, um, the the idea of infinite generations of people being able to build value by owning a home, or build wealth by owning a home, um, I just don't think is sustainable, because it depends on more and more generations of people being able to live further out and in less desirable locations, because that is what makes the inner rings uh, roughly more valuable. More and more people being willing to bid up the price of the stuff that's in better locations is what makes the housing the housing market an effective way to build wealth. Um, but I don't know how long that can go on, because it can't go on forever, as we've seen in like California. You eventually get to a place where people are both unwilling to go out further and unwilling to pay for what currently exists, and so they move to someplace like Texas or Florida, and then the cycle repeats, and eventually, it's going to happen here too, where we get to the point where people no longer want to live further out for cheaper and cheaper housing, but they also don't want to pay millions of dollars for a small house that's closer. I don't really know what point I'm trying to make here, other than the fact that our pattern of urban development just is not sustainable, I don't think, and we're going to have to figure out a better way to do it.
Yeah, I mean, but building off of that point, I think like this is something that people always kind of get shocked by, but the population of Miami proper is 455,000 people, about half a million people, just under. The population of the Miami metro area is 6.5 million. It is an incredibly stark contrast, and I think that it's a unique area because there's Miami, Fort Lauderdale, and West Palm. Like three separate and distinct cities that all kind of coalesce in this weird tri-county area. And there's people coming to and from each one. Commuting to and from each one. You're frozen. I don't know if you're still with
Hello?
me.
Hey, hello?
Oh, okay. You're here.
I lost you for a second. I'm not sure what happened there.
Oh, no, it's all right.
Technical
Your image was
technical
frozen. I
difficulties.
wasn't sure if you were being quiet because you were just listening to me talk and
Oh,
your image
no,
was
no, I,
frozen,
I
or
lost you for a second. Yeah, my bad.
okay.
I don't know what happened there.
No, no worries at all. What I was saying is, a lot of people don't know this, but Miami proper has a very small population
Really?
comparatively. So Miami has a population of just under 500,000 people. The Miami metro area has 6.5 million people.
Mhm.
Like that is a crazy amount of sprawl. And what
Yeah.
happens is like we call it the Tri-County area.
Hmm.
You know, like there's Miami-Dade, Broward County, and Palm Beach that are just
Hmm.
all stacked on top of each other. And they each have their own distinct economic zones.
Hmm.
Like people in Broward can commute to Fort Lauderdale, people in Palm Beach can commute to West Palm, and same with Dade and Miami. But you also have people commuting to and from each one. You know, like it probably takes you during like not too bad of traffic, like an hour and a half to get, or
Yeah.
maybe two, from like Miami to West Palm. You know, and like that, it's a very strange area because it's this sort of three city. I don't know. It's weird. It was you were talking about Fort Worth. I think Dallas is the worst highways I've ever driven on. That was like
Yeah.
terrifying.
It's
Driving
pretty
into
bad,
Dallas.
especially North Dallas is really, really bad in my opinion. It's not good.
Mhm. Yeah, and people, I mean, people always joke about Florida, but like even in your conversation about sprawl, you were talking about how like it fills up. Like very often, I'm kind of fascinated by the stickers I see on cars here.
Yeah.
There's a lot of like flow grown stickers.
Okay.
The people
Yeah.
like to do are like local, where they take Florida and they flip it upside down, so it's the L,
Nice. Yeah. Very
or
creative.
it's
Yeah.
like don't come here, we're full. Like it will just say that on a car, which is really crazy to me. I
Yeah.
don't
So
know.
it's so crazy the disconnect between people wanting to use housing as an investment vehicle, but also not understanding that people coming is what makes the housing more valuable. You know, housing is not worth much in places where people don't want to live. You know, like it's just not. You know, it's so it is funny whenever people you see this sort of anti newcomer sentiment. I mean, I was going to say like anti-immigrant, I guess internal immigrant sentiment from like California, or I imagine, you know, maybe is it against California and Florida, or is it against more like people from the Northeast?
So I did a video about this. It number one is New York, then New Jersey, then California in terms of
Gotcha.
immigration.
Yeah, in Texas, it's 100%. You know, those Californians coming in and ruining Texas. You know,
Yeah, we get a
but
lot of
even
Canadian
yeah.
retirees too.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah, a lot of Quebecers,
Really?
Quebecois.
Are
Hmm.
there? Are I wonder. Uh, that's funny. I wonder if they don't want to go. They don't want to go to Louisiana. I feel like
Man, I mean, I think
maybe
Florida
they
in
moved to get away from the French. Like the
man.
French,
Well, I have
they
a
want
I have a
something
whole
else. They're tired of it.
I have a whole video called "The Florida Dream" that
Yeah,
kind of explores, you know, how Florida boomed and
yeah,
how the same thing that made it grow is there's an inherent contradiction in Florida, right? This
yeah,
sort of deal with the devil that sealed its fate, right? Like we built, I believe, the fourth most densely populated metro area in the country on land that was never supposed to be developed, right? On
yeah,
swampland, like literally everything below Orlando was Everglades
yeah,
that we swept. And it's actually, I've been trying to go on hikes lately because I really like
yeah.
the idea of going on hikes, but I live in Florida, so it's very
Mhm.
strange. And I was walking and I just came across like vast like sand dunes
Yeah,
in the middle of like a downtown. And I was like, what? There's sand dunes here? And I was researching it. And there's supposed to be a lot of sand dunes in Florida. But what happens is all of the housing was built on top of them
yeah,
because that was the only way to get away any bit of elevation away from the water,
yeah.
you know, which is just like fascinating
Building
to
on
me.
top of sand, literally.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but that oh, dude, I get into a ramble about this like every
Mhm.
single live stream that I do, but it's that Florida was literally like torn away from like part. So the northern part of Florida was torn away from Africa from Pangea, right? So
Mhm.
Florida was supposed to be a lot more like a sort of savanna,
Yeah.
you know, and it's at the same uh it's at the same latitude as is it the Sahara Desert? It might be the Sahara Desert. Like Florida should have been like this dry kind of wasteland,
Mhm.
but it's surrounded by water on three
Right.
sides. What happens is the part of Florida where I live was underwater until very recently. And actually what happened was that water came down, but also sediment just built up.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of the soil where I live is actually just sediment. It's not proper like rock where and
Yeah.
earth where it would be for the rest of the country. And that's what made Florida so flat. And being surrounded by so much water, the water literally seeped into the ground because there was no current. You know, and that's what made it so swampy. So
Mm-hmm.
developing this land is inherently contradictory, and that's an alarm that I always forget to turn that alarm off. But like developing this land, man, I really went way too far back with that.
No, it's good. It's interesting to hear about. I often think about regional identity, and sometimes I think it's very nice that Texas has its own regional regionalism that's disconnected from the Confederacy. Because I think a lot of time, because I think the Texas Revolution is more healthy regional identity than your typical like Confederate revanchism that you sometimes see in like Southern regional pride, I guess. So, the Texas Revolution wasn't perfect, but I think on the whole, much the vibes around what people think of the Texas Revolution, at least, are healthier than what your average person from like the Deep South thinks of, like the Confederacy, for example.
Yeah, Lyndon Johnson's brother was named Sam Houston Johnson.
My middle name is William Travis, who this wasn't on purpose, but that was the name of the commander at the Alamo.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So there's definitely, that wasn't on purpose, but I have mentioned it to people, and like people, know who that is. And I just think that it's interesting that there's a sort of different regional identity in Texas that's disconnected from the South as it's more generally conceived of.
See, I feel like there's an interesting loop there, because I feel like Tejano culture seems like it's a really big part of it also, right? And there's the sort of, I think there's a loop where a lot of cowboy culture comes from Tejano culture.
Yeah.
But then also like where I'm from in Brazil is very sort of country.
Yeah.
And like there's actual just like cowboys there.
Yeah.
Like that is kind of like in the way that Texas, like people will kind of play that up and wear the hats and do rodeos. Like that is something that you can see where I'm from in Brazil. And that is also both because it is like authentic to the actual land, but also because I think people see like cowboy hats and cowboys on TV from American shows growing up. And it's this weird sort of like way that one informs the other.
Yeah, there's definitely more like it very much depends on where you live to what kind of cultural influence you get. I mean, definitely like San Antonio and the bigger cities like closer to the border, definitely more like Tejano influence, and like El Paso and like the bigger, but like I live in North Texas, and there's obviously a big Hispanic population here too, but definitely not the same as like San Antonio, for instance. And so I would say that, and then of course I'm just not part of that culture, so I probably couldn't comment on it as well, since it's not something that I am immersed in. But I definitely notice like, I think people like to have like a regional identity. People like to, have some connection. The regional identity thing definitely isn't as strong as it used to be in the United States. But I think people still like to have that regional identity. People from New York are proud to be from New York. People from California are generally proud to be from California. People from Texas are definitely proud to be from Texas. And I think it's just good. Or it's interesting that Texas has a very particular regional identity that's disconnected from, I think, the rest of rest of the country, or it feels like that sometimes.
See, do you think that translates to a greater sense of localism in any way? Because I do think that a big problem of our politics today is that everything is national,
Yeah.
and the state government, the thing that actually does have a much bigger impact on your daily life, state and local governments,
Yeah.
we don't pay attention to. Like I myself am guilty of this. Just local politics are not remotely as interesting or dramatic, and I think that we also have a lot more ability to actually change things in our local politics, and I think that might be a way that Gen Z can sort of like combat doomerism, is by actually getting involved in ways that are more directly impactful, and not just sort of like not just sort of looking at like polls all the time and all these national things. Do you think that do you see more of that in a place like Texas that has more of a
No.
regional identity?
I don't
No.
think no. I mean, I think, people care about their regional identity here, and people care about Texas, but like, I think it can be overstated to the degree to which people from Texas feel like, oh yeah, like, this is some people do. I think we feel like we have a unique regional identity, in the sense that I don't think that people from definitely east of like Dallas don't feel like they're part of like the South necessarily. And you don't feel like you're part of like the West Coast. And it's not quite a desert, so you don't necessarily feel like you have tons in common with like, New Mexico.
Mm.
I mean, it starts to turn into a desert at some parts, yeah. But I don't know. I don't really think that Texas is immune from any of the nationalization of politics. I think a lot of our politicians recently have also made a big effort to nationalize Texas politics, because of course, everyone wants to move up. Politicians want to move up in the, they don't want to be satisfied with Texas politics. A lot of them want to move up. And
It's interesting because the Texas governorship isn't particularly powerful, right? I think it's actually like one of the weakest in the country.
Yeah, it is pretty weak. But Dan Patrick, Lieutenant Governor, he has done a lot to nationalize Texas politics. And I think, going back to the charter school issue, or not charter school, the private school voucher issue, that I think has really, the dominance of the pro private school voucher position really shows the dominance of the nationalization of politics in Texas. I mean, I think that was a really symbolic thing for a lot of people, in a way that I think is hard to explain. But I think that used to be a really bipartisan issue, in a way that emphasized that kind of localism, where you would have rural Republicans and Democrats coming together to say like, no, we oppose this because on average it's going to be worse for rural areas, and Democrats are more ideologically opposed to private schools. But the dominance of the pro school voucher position, I think, definitely speaks to the nationalization of politics, even in Texas, even though we have a very strong state identity.
I guess just to start wrapping up,
yeah,
a little bit. What do you think the people our age in particular can do to sort of interact with politics in, I guess, I don't want to say a healthier manner, but maybe in a more effective manner? Because I truly believe, like there's the meme of the person who's constantly looking on Twitter and retweeting things and thinking that they're having some sort of impact, right?
Yeah.
And the proportion of stress that politics causes you, and the amount that you think about it, versus the impact that you're actually having, can be very, very disproportionate. I think what is your, I guess, sort of advice on how to make yourself more useful, and perhaps even a little bit less hopeless when it comes to our politics?
That's a good question. I think you have to just do something in person. you have to try and do something in person. I think that's the number one thing, because doing stuff online is not going to make you feel like you're very happy for very long. I don't think it's just not. I think I will say, if you want to feel like you're having an impact, absolutely, you can have more impact at the local level and at the state level. I'll say, even at the federal level, though, as long as you're not talking about a wedge issue in the sense of an issue that a candidate campaigns on, representatives are less open to constituent input on those things, in my experience. If you get 10 people to call in all on the same day on some sort of thing that isn't constantly in the news, you very well may be able to have an impact on their position on that sort of thing, in my experience. And that's just from my sort of professional background. But if you're talking about stuff that politicians campaign on, I mean, to be frank, you're not going to change your politician's opinion on abortion. You're not going to change your politician's opinion on guns, probably. I mean, it's just not going to happen, because they campaign on these things and they get massive amounts of money to run on these things. And these issues motivate people to turn out in a way that the smaller issues don't. So I would say, to combat doomerism, which I think is sort of what you're asking here, or a part of what you're asking, you have to start with correct expectations. I think one thing that the nationalization of politics has done that's bad is it's convinced us, or it has misinformed us about the issues that are under debate. There's a lot of things that happen that aren't in the news, but the things in the news are often the things that you as an individual can have the least impact on. So I would say setting expectations about the kinds of issues that you can have an impact on is important. I think getting out and actually doing something, anything, is important. I would talk to your friends about politics and try and do things together. I went to a protest recently, and that was fun. I think it has to be something that you do with other people. I think that I'm really rambling here, but these are all sort of disconnected thoughts. You have to do things with other people as well, because being a lonely soldier fighting online or fighting even in person, it's not going to be good for very long. So I think get plugged in with a group that you appreciate and enjoy. I would try and do things with your friends. And I would try and set expectations about the things that you can actually do, which I don't know, this doesn't sound very hopeful. I think you have to just maintain hope in the face of despair. You just have to believe that you can do things. You can actually have an impact. You have to have a sort of impossible optimism about the circumstances, because people who believe that things can change and that things can get better are the only people who have ever made things change or made things better. Is what I would say. That was not very, that was very long and rambly, and I don't know how hopeful that was. I think, it's also maybe just, sometimes things can just suck. I think sometimes things can suck, and I don't want to lie to people. Things do suck. The Trump administration is awful. I hate almost everything that they're doing. I don't want to lie to people and be like, things are great right now. But I will say, things have been worse. Things have been worse in the past. And, people rebuilt the world after World War I and World War II. And things looked a lot worse in that period of time. I mean, no matter how bad Trump is, there was a time where it really looked like the Allies might not prevail after World War II or during World War II. I mean, the Nazis had swept Europe, and Joseph Stalin was, turning out to be running an authoritarian nightmare state. You know, it looked like the ideologies that would come to dominate the world for a good period of time were not going to be compatible with freedom as we understand it. And especially during the 30s, whenever, you know, the Great Depression was going on, and things did not look like they were going so well for liberal democracy either. But people overcame that and they rebuilt, and I think we can do the same now.
Yeah, I mean, for as much as you said you rambled, I thought that was actually a very good answer. I think you're someone who has a really interesting perspective and observation on all these things, and there's so many questions that I had that I also just didn't get to ask you. So I'd absolutely love to have you on again.
Yeah.
I guess just before we wrap up, if you have any closing thoughts or any last questions you would like to ask me.
I guess just thanks so much for having me on. You know, go subscribe to Ryan Geddie's YouTube channel. I'm like 10 away from 4,000, which is super
awesome.
super fun for me. I don't know, just I don't know what's your solution to the Gen Z doomerism? What's
my solution?
Yeah, tack on another 2 hours. Let's go. What's your solution to the? I'm just kidding. But I mean, do you have an answer to that question that you just asked me?
Oh man, I don't know. I think I've been struggling with it a lot myself. Honestly, I think it's we live in such a strange moment, and I know that every generation of young people that has ever existed has felt like they had a particular chip on their shoulders, and everyone's always been like, oh my god, are the kids all right, or oh, things are so like kids these days, you know. But that doesn't make I guess the sort of ubiquitous way that the trope echoes throughout history doesn't make it any less difficult to sort of figure out and live through.
Exactly.
You know, like there's so many things about like, oh, your 20s are hard, your 20s are not supposed to have things figured out, and then you're living through your 20s, you're like, man, this shit's hard. You know, I think that what I would advise to people, a thought that I find among a lot of people that I am also guilty of myself is of thinking like, man, it's too late. Like I didn't do enough, and now
so
like
over.
I'm never gonna be able to come back from this. Like I think I started my channel like 21 ish. I think I started my channel at 21, and I was like, man, I should have started my channel when I was younger. And then my girlfriend was like, dude, if you started your channel when you were younger, you probably would have been really stupid. I was like, it's like, yeah, I probably would have. I'm glad I didn't start my channel when I was younger. And I think we forget just how young that we are, man. It's like you know. And then another thing also is, I think with COVID, so many people didn't have exactly like the college experience that they wanted to have. I think a couple years flew by that they didn't expect. Right? Like COVID was 5 years ago, and that's insane. I think that we shouldn't lament so much the past and lost time and all these things. Like you are actually very young, and there's so much that you can achieve, and you know, like whatever sort of thing you feel like is holding you back, a lot of times if you just go out and do it, it will help. In terms of I guess I'm speaking more personally, but in terms of politics, you know, political eras pass. You know, the one that we are in right now just also feels like it particularly sucks. I think something that seems so simple that I hadn't thought about until like embarrassingly recently is that there's no end to politics. There's no end to history. It's not like, oh, FDR, we did the New Deal and America's liberal now. We won. Right? Like there's always going to be another election. There's always going to be another fight. It's never going to be over. But then there's a parallel to I think just like regular life in that way too, right? Because people will complain about like, oh, all this hardship and I'm doing all these things and I have to go to work and I have to this and that. And then but like when those things stop, you die. Like that is, you know, like to be human is to sort of struggle and suffer and like also dream and love and all of these things. I think it's very similar with politics. It's like there's going to be like movements that you love and movements that are terrible. And I think that's not to say don't call out like all of the ridiculous, terrible things that are happening. Like, there's genuine, like, horrible precedents being set right now. Like, executive power is expanding in a terrifying way, and executive power, once it expands, never contracts. Like, it never goes back. Power transfers to the next person in office. And then there's a remarkable lack of foresight, I think, in the conservative movement right now to not realize, like, how much power they're giving the next Democratic president that will inevitably at some point come around. But that, you know, I think going back to some, I guess what I said at the start, Trump is unprecedented in a lot of ways, but the sort of figure that he is in American politics is one that we've seen before, right? Like, demagogues, like, some people you even like might be demagogues. Like, FDR certainly had his own, like, problems with you know, like, running for 4 terms, like putting Japanese people in camps, you know, like that's really terrible stuff. Like, there's genuine arguments against FDR, like Andrew Jackson, you know, Theodore Roosevelt. I always go back. I'm such a character driven person because I always just go back to mentioning these guys. I feel like it's such a helpful frame to understand history, but I think I can kind of harp on them a little bit too much. Don't always focus on individuals also is another thing. It's like, personalities are not always everything. Presidents are fun to study. And I do think that we kind of have gotten to a place where we overlook individual personalities a little bit in our politics, right? It's like, what are the actual, you know, like, let's say AOC and Ilhan Omar, for example, probably have, like, pretty similar politics. But, like, we probably overlook the actual, their habits and political maneuvering that would make them different types of leaders. You know, like, I think
why is someone like Bernie Sanders, who's, you know, an actual socialist, or I think he calls himself a democratic socialist. Does he still call himself a democratic socialist? So, I mean, he's some form of socialist. Why is that kind of person appealing to someone like Joe Rogan, who is also supportive of Donald Trump? Whereas someone like Kamala Harris, who is, you know, definitely more moderate economically than, you know, Bernie Sanders, is not appealing to someone like that.
I'll say 3 things. I think, number one, there's an obvious, like, racial and gender component that you can't overlook. Not saying that that's the defining thing for most people, but just if you don't say that, then that's ridiculous. Like, that is a thing for a lot of people. I think that authenticity and the outsider status. I think that Bernie Sanders, whether you love him or hate him, you can look at him and see he's been saying the same thing for his entire political career. Yeah. He has evolved shockingly little. Yeah. You know, honestly, I feel like people are always talking about how his consistency is a good thing, but I feel like being able to change your mind is also kind of an underrated political talent that maybe Bernie hasn't.
I said once that the best and worst things about Bernie Sanders is that he is an unreconstructed new left socialist. Like, these are both the best and the worst things about Bernie Sanders, but that's what he is. He is an unreconstructed new left socialist.
See, but and that's the number one thing is, like, I will talk to Bernie. Talk to Bernie. I mean, I'd love to talk to Bernie on here, but I'll talk about Bernie. I talk about Bernie with people that aren't as political, and the number one thing they say immediately is, like, oh, the socialist, man, like, socialism. Like, it's that one piece of branding alone just, and I know, like, there's the argument, and it's an argument I've been sympathetic to in the past of, like, oh man, they're just going to call whatever Democrat a socialist. That's true. But, like, Bernie saying I'm a democratic socialist, that does genuinely, to, like, the average voter, I think, do something. And it's dumb because he's more of, like, a social democrat, but then you get more into semantics, and it's like, I don't know, man. I think that the vibes are the other thing, right? It's just like, he's just an outsider in the same sort of, it's a similar appeal to what Trump had, right? Like, the anti-institution. He's talking bad about Hillary Clinton and all these things. He's talking about the billionaires, and, you know, like, Occupy Wall Street and the Tea Party movement. Like, it's no coincidence that those things sort of happen simultaneously. Yeah. Right. Like, and Trump kind of builds himself out of the Tea Party movement, and Bernie, same thing, like, channels Occupy Wall Street energy. And it's funny to see where the energy from those popular movements have gone, because it feels like I don't know what the Republicans are doing. Because like Trump is not the Tea Party. Like Doge, for all of its weirdness, is a lot more akin to the kind of like tech libertarianism slash
Yeah.
I am the one who knows what's best sort of politics that we were talking about earlier than it is actual just like reducing government spending.
There's
You
a
know,
quote
and
from Thomas Massey. Are you familiar with Thomas Massey?
yes, big
And
libertarian.
yeah, and he says he had I forget what his actual words were, but he basically had like a kind of black pilling moment when he realized that the Tea Party voters didn't really want libertarians. They just wanted the craziest son of a bitch in the race, is what he actually said. That was his, I think, actual
Oh,
quote. And
that's incredible.
I think there's a through line there from, people didn't really care about the libertarianism of the Tea Party beyond a superficial level. I think, or some did. I don't want to, paint everyone with the same brush, but I think there's an extent to which the populist anger definitely is the same populist anger of MAGA. One of the things that we'll have to talk about at another time, but I really want to ask you about is, Andrew Jackson. We had a comparison to Andrew Jackson and Trump, sort of closer to the beginning of this conversation, and Jackson, for all of his populism, was offering the common person something, and I wonder what you would perceive Trump as offering, like the common person.
Man, I'm gonna push back on that a little bit, because I
What?
think if you go back to the idea of Jackson offering the common person something material, I think that if you look at 1824, that election, every major candidate is a Democratic Republican. They have remarkably similar policies, except for mostly like disagreements on tariffs. That is probably the earliest example of like a primarily personality driven election. I think that election, Andrew Jackson, for like most of giving like by the time of 1824, most white men without property could already vote. What Jackson does is Jackson is sort of like the representation of the common man in that way. Well, because 1824 he loses. So the common man has 4 years to have this sort of story of like, oh, the like Washington took that from me, right? Like this sort of like born and bred John Quincy Adams, like the establishment. They wouldn't have talked about it in those terms, but a parallel. That sentiment really does brew. So I think that I'd say Jackson's election was more about identity than
I guess I
about
perceived him
material.
as like, the universal white male suffrage guy, and that sounds like that I mean, I know that that's definitely a reductive view of it, but I think that's how I perceived him.
I think he was more of a beneficiary of it, but who was also able to speak to it in a very, very good way. I think that like that's the main difference between Jefferson and Jackson, right? Jeffersonian democracy is this idea that the land-owning white man is the ideal voter. Like that is the person that we want our country to be comprised of, because he will not be reliant on markets and speculation and all of these things, like all these fake things like finances. He owns his own land. He is self-dependent on his wife to make all of his clothes and his slaves to actually work the land and all these things, but he is self-sufficient. Jacksonian democracy expands that in the idea of like, no, just white men in general should be the ones that decide our elections. And I think that because if you look, like by the time that I believe the first time Jackson ran, 20 something% of the population voted. By the second time he ran, I think it was 50 something. So there's already a huge boost before Jackson even wins. Not to say that Jackson didn't actually deliver material conditions for the common man, but I do think that it was more of, when I think of Jackson, I think more of the ways in which he expanded the executive. I think Jackson made the presidency extremely powerful in a way that the founders could never have expected. And the vibes.
I think he definitely had the vibes. Yeah. I just wonder sometimes, even if it isn't necessarily true that Jackson was, his popularity may, even if you disagree with the idea that Jackson materially was behind universal white male suffrage, or that was a big, thing behind his candidacy. I just wonder sometimes what is even the theoretical promise of Trump. And I wonder about that sometimes. But we don't have to go into that now.
No, but I want to answer your question.
Yeah.
Man, I think the promise of Trump has shifted. I think it was really build the wall at first, right? I think there was a genuine coalition, or not even there was a genuine cohort of Trump supporters that did just literally want a wall along the southern border. Right. And it's really interesting to see that there hasn't been any political consequence to that necessarily. And I think that more than anything, because, man, there are genuine, protectionist people that I think wanted Trump tariffs and other people that wanted a genuine Trump crackdown on immigration. That are very upset because he's going about them in the most ridiculous ways possible, right? I've seen folks who support mass deportation being furious about Kilmar Abrego Garcia or Mahmoud Khalil, because those literally seem like they're handpicked to stop your movement, to get whatever you're trying to do thrown out of here. So I do think there was a sort of promise of less immigration, closed borders, tariffs. I think, Trump kept Biden kept the Trump tariffs. 2020, right? And I think he had a much more sensible policy that was paired with industrialization, right? Industrial policy, the CHIPS Act, very, very good legislation. And Trump doesn't have that. So I feel like there is a genuine Trump, I think Trump genuinely, his most material political consequence was that he kind of realigned the consensus on trade and on China.
We'll see how long that lasts, I wonder.
But it feels like he's burning that down now.
Right?
The next Democratic president,
it's going to be so negatively polarized.
If I were to guess, they're going to be a big free trader. Big free trader. Protectionism, whatever you think, is going to have a really bad name. So I think those were probably some of the material conditions that were promised there. But I will wrap up because I'm getting pretty hungry. But I really appreciate your time. Would love to have you back on here. You guys, if you're on here and you have not subscribed to Ryan yet, what are you doing? He has a really, really awesome channel. Help him get to 4,000 subscribers, because when the numbers go up, it makes us feel good. So But
within the deepest, it's so over, I found within me an invincible, we are so back. That's what I'll close with.
See, this is fun too, because I feel like in my videos I try to be so well spoken and do the script, and then we can get here on a live stream and just feel it's so over, we're so back. And, Okay, so closing out on that note, thank you so much, guys, for watching. We'll see you next time.
See you next time.